Good evening and a welcome, or wherever you are in the part of the world, I should just say welcome. We are without time zones here. Welcome to the Belfast Photo Festival and this discussion called Depiction of the Female Figure in Photography. And it's very much flipping on its head the long-standing male gaze in visual culture. We're going to explore what it means to be female on both sides of the lens and how this changes the subject and charges the artist with layers of historical, social, and cultural responsibility. And I'm delighted to be joined by two leading photographers, Hannah Starkey. Hannah, good evening.
Hello, it's lovely to be here.
It's good to see you. And Dragana Juricic, welcome.
Hello, hi.
Before we begin, we're going to use the time that we have and the visual medium to look at both your works. And we've asked you to provide us with not so much a slideshow, but certainly a representation of your work. And we're going to start, Hannah, with you. Okay. Belfast-born Hannah Starkey has been photographing the female figure for over 20 years and is best known for her images of women in staged settings. She has said of her own photographs that they are explorations of everyday experiences and observations of inner city life from a female perspective. Let's have a look.
Can you press play, please? So, I'm going to show you a 10-minute show and talk very briefly about what I've been up to all this time. So for over 20 years, I've been photographing women, and it comes from two things, actually: my deep respect for photography and my deep respect for women. And to be able to spend a life where you combine the two is very special to me. So I've been doing it since I left college. It struck me that as a woman, I wasn't seeing the images in the world that I felt I wanted to see. As a female visual artist, I decided I'd put them there. So what you're looking at the minute is my eye, I suppose, how I photograph, how I see the world. And they're all female protagonists that are kind of part autobiographical, part observational, part street scenes, part setup. I think a lot of my work is a sort of hybrid of the photography language, and it's just, you know, photography has such an amazing history when it comes to how it represents women that it's kind of interesting to work with that. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. But I've photographed recently a lot of protests. I feel like we're in the age of reckoning, the age of protest. And as a photographer, my work is shown in museums or galleries. I also work commercially, which runs kind of parallel to my artwork, if you like, and it's mostly editorial and shows in magazines. And I really like having the duality of these two outlets for photography. We're whizzing through what I've been working on recently, which was a commission for celebrating women in the city, the financial city of London. I was their first artist in residence. And then the next thing that I'm showing you is a lockdown project. This is also a lockdown project that was commissioned by Wallpaper Magazine and the FT, and it was really kind of looking at the pandemic and how it affected the streets of London and how it affected people in their parks and dog walks. And this is the last image that I will tell you about later, because it has begun to inspire me so much that I can think of nothing else. So I will just tell you about that a little bit later. So that's me, really. I look forward to chatting and talking photography. It's my favorite thing. So thank you.
So I'm just going to talk briefly about two projects that I've done in the last 7 years. And one of them is You the Lost Country, that deals with the loss of national identity and loss of country called Yugoslavia. So for people who don't know, Yugoslavia was one of the richest socialist countries in the world. It disappeared or started falling apart in the 1980s after the death of Josip Broz Tito, who was a lifelong president of Yugoslavia. And his death coincided with the rise of nationalism all across Europe, which we see really prominent now. The kind of emerging political parties that came to power around that time after his death developed this culture of mistrust between different ethnic groups in Yugoslavia, and the war started. And I come from a mixed family. My father is a Croatian and my mother is Serbian. So until 1990s, I was considered as Yugoslav, which was the nationality I was denied after the 1990, after Croatia proclaimed its independence. And here you see the last picture that my father took for a couple of decades. It's a photograph of our burned down apartment, which happened on the first day of war in former Yugoslavia, in my hometown, actually. And he took this photograph to record the damages for insurance company. And it kind of marks the beginning of him stopping, because he was a kind of ardent amateur photographer, and me starting taking photographs. So I came to Ireland in 1999 because I was more and more disillusioned with kind of politics that were developing in the new Croatian state. And while I was here, I came across the book called Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, which was written by Anglo-Irish woman Rebecca West and published in 1941. And it's probably the most influential book ever written about ex-Yugoslavia. And Rebecca West said that she wrote this book because she knew the country will disappear. And actually, since the publication of the book in 1941, the country disappeared twice, once in 1941 and once in 1991. So I used the book as basically creating an itinerary for me to travel and follow for my project. And also why I was interested in Rebecca West was a comparison to other writers and journalists who came to Balkans. She never othered Balkans or Yugoslavia. And I think the reason why she didn't is because she was the other herself. She was a feminist. She wrote for New Woman magazine since the age of 16. She was a single mother in the 1930s. She really didn't know and switched national identities often between Irish, British, Scottish. So I think she kind of, in her own displacements, she really well understood the culture or the country like Yugoslavia. And so as I said, I ritualistically followed her journey, starting on the same day, on the Easter in 75 years later. And like I moved to an hour because in her book, it's 500,000 words. She gives you exact roadmap to travel. And I think it's very important to have that when you deal with a really complex issues such as loss of country, loss of national identity, because I think if I didn't have this roadmap, I might have still been walking around there. And I just want to say, like many projects of mine, this one also was a sort of a failure, because I started it in 1911, and my idea was to kind of build a kind of metaphysical country in which my identity can reside. Because I took what Roland Barthes said about photography, that it's more akin to magic than to art, quite literally. So I thought to do that, but very early on, I realized that it was a kind of a funeral procession in which I was following a death or a ghost of a writer through a country that disappeared. And really only at the point of publication of the book in 2015 did I realize what this project done for me. And what it has done for me, it has freed me from idea of needing national identity, or actually tying the identity to national identity. And I'm going to move quickly to my own unknown project, which I've been working on for the last 6 years. And this project started in 2014 when I was working on something else, and I went to visit my grandmother's graveyard, and I came across this grave of a woman called Gordana Čavić. I asked my mom who she was, and my mom was very suspiciously quiet. So I started digging, and it turned out that she was my aunt once removed, and that she escaped Yugoslavia in 1954 from a tiny village of 200 people practically illiterate, and ended up in Paris. And when she escaped, Yugoslav government imprisoned her mother back home and used this as a collateral to make Gordana Čavić spy on the very people that has helped her escape Yugoslavia. So it's a work that I started doing in order to explore stereotypes about Eastern European women. You know, you can either be a spy, kind of James Bond body, a prostitute, or a cleaner. So I'm sure, you know, in some ways, Gordana Čavić ticked a few of those boxes. And the work, as most of my work, is done in image text format. So, and it's usually in exhibition, I present both images and text, and it's done in a number of chapters. This chapter about her is one, and then there is another chapter about L'inconnue de la Seine, or Unknown Woman of the Seine. If you know, if this face seems familiar to you, it's because she is a face of Resuscity Anne. So the trivia fact here is that the resuscitation doll was a male face in the beginning, but because so many men find it uncomfortable to do mouth to a male dummy, they changed it into her face. And L'Inconnue de la Seine, according to kind of urban legend, was a young girl that drowned herself in the late 1800s. And when they fished her out of the Seine, they found that her face, the pathologist on duty found her so beautiful that he decided to make a dead mask out of her face. And then this dead mask became a muse to so many artists of the 20th century, like Rilke, Anais Nin, Man Ray, Nabokov. They all made work about her. And I then started thinking about this kind of whole idea of muse in the history of Western art, and how muses are often kind of depicted nude, because nude is one of the biggest cliches of Western art tradition. And so I wanted to see, and I did lots of research in how men, traditionally male artists, were depicting a female nude. And I wanted to see, would I behave any differently if I did it? So I'm really uncomfortable with portraiture. I love Hannah's work and how she does it. I don't, you know, I really struggle basically. So it was a way to challenge myself. So I invited 100 women to be photographed in my studio naked. It was an open call, so first come, first serve basis. And it was an experiment, so I didn't have a clue what I'm going to do. So when the first person came in, I did what photographers normally do. I told her how to move, where to look, how, you know, and the images were so stiff because it's such a sensitive topic, the nude. And I then just asked the first person who I photographed to come back again to photograph her again. And then I told her, listen, like, you do whatever you need to do. This is the space I can see, and you move any way you want. And there was this cheap IKEA curtain that kind of was a pun to like a veil of a muse. And they were free to use it any way they wanted, like to hide or to discard it. I think what happened was such a variety of images that I would never be able to do if I was trying to make this project on my own. Like, I don't have it's not in my capacity, for example, to tell someone, now turn yourself upside down, spread your legs, and I don't know, smile. So that was interesting. There was only one thing I asked of people to do, and that was to look back into the camera. And women also chose the final image, which was very tricky for someone. It was very tricky for a photographer and someone who likes to be in control. And actually what I discovered that maybe except in one case, women always chose the strongest image as opposed to the most beautiful image, which was a wonderful thing. And I think I can refer to some situations that happened during the shoot later on in the talk, because I don't want to go on forever. So I'm going to stop sharing this. And then maybe we can get to Q&A. Thank you.
Dragana, thank you so much for that, and to Hannah as well. So we've got a sense, and I'm sure there are a lot of people watching now who already know your work, and we have questions coming through. I will come to these questions as we come towards the end of the chat. So please keep the questions coming through. There's a question already talking about the technical aspects of photography, but before we come to that, could we just talk first about being known as a female photographer? Hannah, why is your gender front and center of your work?
Well, I suppose for me, I started photography I started photography at school, but I really studied it in the 90s. And it was such a male-dominated profession. I mean, even though it's, in terms of the history of photography, it's quite egalitarian towards women, but in the kind of day-to-day workings of it, it was very male-dominated, like most professions those days. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but also the very limited kind of representation of women that were coming out of this industry, and particularly about the male gaze. As a young woman, I felt kind of frustrated that it was a very kind of one-dimensional look at women, or idea of women. And I kind of, as a young feminist and growing up in Belfast, I knew that women were sort of so much more. So I thought, given how much I enjoy photography, and that, going back to my respect for women, that to be able to combine the two and challenge this male gaze was a really amazing opportunity. And that sounds like it was premeditated. It wasn't. Nothing in my photography career has been. It's sort of more going with the situations I'm presented with. So in making this work, I find it quite interesting that there was a danger, particularly in the 90s, in the late 90s, that it could be dismissed because it was sort of feminine art, if you like. And I thought that was kind of interesting, quite challenging. And also coming from Belfast, you realize that if it's challenged, then it must be kind of good. It must be sort of putting somebody's nose out of joint. So I took that space. I took what was considered, the female perspective or the female experience through photography.
Okay, Dragana, if I could bring you in then. So why do you want to be known as a female photographer, and what is it about the female gaze that interests you?
I mean, I don't necessarily, I just want to be known as an artist. I don't want to be known as a female artist. I mean, it's undeniably that I'm a female gender, and that the certain experiences that I had in life shape the way I look at the world and make work. But if I could choose, I would love that gender is not front and center of what I do.
But interestingly, though, you because your work rejects the male gaze, you're putting your own take on what is happening. How autobiographical, Hannah, is your work, especially looking at your own experiences of being a woman? And I was also very struck about you being a mother of 2 teenage girls, as am I, and I just wondered, how much that has influenced the journey that you're on as a photographer.
Yeah, well, I think as time goes by, you realize that influence is more and more. At the beginning, I sort of denied that it was about me, but I think any artist really, that they are in their work in terms of, well, certainly in how I represent women. So it is a collaboration in that sense. And I love to learn from women. So sort of going out and creating this creative space together, we can talk about what it means to be female. And that changes, like I said, I've been doing this for 25 years. So as a young woman, you have a very particular perspective. And then as a young mother of 2 daughters, and then as a middle-aged woman and an older woman with teenage daughters, that all of that plays into how I see images and how I see their influence in our world, in both how it makes me feel at certain stages and how it influences my daughters. So you know, I do actually show. I use my daughters as a sounding board because I really consider their opinion as very important to my work, and they are harsh critics. You know, they don't hold back.
Mm.
But it's sort of together we've kind of formed this language of understanding of what it's like in their world, because they're in the world of Instagram. I'm not. And if the image that I'm making has kind of a weight to it in a way that might hold their attention longer, how they might think about the image, deconstruct the image, that sort of thing. So they're my critics and my testing zones, you know what I mean?
Dragana, you spoke really eloquently and about growing up in former Yugoslavia and experiencing war. I remember being there a couple of years ago, and even being from Northern Ireland and having grown up in the Troubles, similar to Hannah, when I went over to Bosnia, and I was very struck by the youth of the headstones. People having died, mainly men, in 1991, and you cannot help but feel it. Did you feel compelled to start photographing because you experienced war? Did it make you almost view the female as radical?
Well, actually, I mean, I started photographing, I think, because of the war, but it was because camera gives you some kind of almost a mirage that you can order the chaos. And actually, when our house burned down and my parents lost everything that they worked for in their entire life, and we were living in a basement of a hotel for a couple of months, my dad came up to me maybe a few weeks in, and he brought me a camera as a present. And I don't know where he got it or how, but you know, he gave me a tool to kind of navigate the craziness around me, and that marked the beginning of my work as a photographer. But when it comes to, you know, thinking about gender in terms of all of that, like Yugoslavia, at least in its socialist edition, was a country where the women were paid equally, and they fought in the Second World War, and were in a part of the consignment in the army. And so when I came to live in Ireland, and it's at the same time, it's a very patriarchal society traditionally. And when I came to live in Ireland, which is matriarchal society, but then feeling what church and state have done to women. And, you know, I think that really contributed to the whole project of 100 Muses, because when I put the open call out, and I was doing it in 5 weeks, all in 5 weeks, the shoot. And my friends were saying, you'll never get 100 Irish women to be photographed nude in that space of time. And it was 2015. So Repeal the Aid campaign just started. And I think so many Irish women were pissed off. And this, you know, I think I didn't set to make some protest images, but I think women participation in the project was in a big percentage of protest action. Yeah.
And do you feel the same, Hannah? I mean, and there are questions coming in about asking why is gender relevant, and I'm going to come to that in a moment. But did growing up in Northern Ireland make you view women differently, and did it make the female as front and center a radical artistic act?
Absolutely. I think that's where it all comes from, really. You know, the way I grew up in Belfast, I was kind of quite close to women that had held very strong political views and protested for peace. I mean, I didn't know the peace people directly, but my mum would have known them, and she was very proud of them and very proud of what they achieved. The fact that, you know, women can bring two communities, two opposing sides of the community together to march for peace is extraordinary, and win the Nobel Peace Prize for it. So I don't know, I've just always seen a very strong women that seem to speak the truth and have the strength of their convictions, is what I grew up with. And I think in a really patriarchal society like the North at that stage, their voices weren't heard, and it's something I've always felt very frustrated by. But at the same time, you know, the strength and the fact that they, in a way, well, maybe even by accident, but brought feminism in, second wave feminism in the very early stages of the conflict, was just so enlightened. You know, that was my norm, that was my real. And, you know, also, actually, I was thinking about this recently. I grew up with a female prime minister. So in the 70s and 80s. So, you know, it seemed totally normal to me that women were, I suppose, kind of what they had to say was very important, and it should be listened to, and their influence should be used as, you know, as something very constructive in all their lives. And I was so disappointed when you hit a certain age and you go out into the world, and particularly in the 90s, that it wasn't really like that. And so then I just set about kind of, I suppose, through my photographs, turning, they're not heroes as such, but photographing them in such a sensitive way that it pays tribute to them, really. And photographing women who maybe don't subscribe to the archetypes that we see in, say, advertising or our general kind of visual culture of women in the 90s. What I think is interesting now when we talk about gender and we look at photography is that it's not binary anymore, and those restrictions aren't there anymore. And I think that is because of women and women in photography or women in the art world and their push, and that's just amazing progress. So, you know, to be able to start with women in the 70s and seeing what they could achieve, and then going through the last 5 decades almost, and seeing what they have achieved, is something to celebrate for me. So I don't want to kind of dismiss being female, but I can totally understand why, you know, such strict ideas of gender have been squashed.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to actually open the floor to questions as we're going along, because they're really interesting, and I want to involve you as much as possible. And Terry Core had put this question in, which you know, I've got down in my notes, but thank you. He's saying, why is gender relevant? Surely the image is what matters. And I mean, I had actually, Dragana, wanted to ask, you know, should we be so hung up on gender?
Well, I mean, I would love to live in a world where gender does not matter, but I don't think that's a reality. Yes, the progress has been made, and I think it's important to me because I'm a female person, and I can see, and this is what Hannah referenced at the beginning of her talk, maybe how, you know, like I can still see the traces of it. Dealing with this female subject is not appetizing to many curators, you know, so that still exists. It's not like it doesn't exist. Things are shifting and changing, but slowly. So like, I wish it didn't matter, and yes, the image is important, but we also need to know what kind of context is that image made in, because photography without context means nothing.
But it's interesting. I mean, would your 100 muses have responded to a man as they did to you?
Well, I'm sure that they responded very differently to me than a man. And actually, I got a number of letters and emails from participants of this project, and they said that the normal reaction was like, oh, I was like shitting myself, and then I came into your studio and I pushed through, and then I felt so free. And lots of women started dancing in the middle of it, and I was like, why are you dancing? I can't focus, you know. And then they would say, like, I'm dancing because this is the first time I'm naked, and it's not a medical exam, and there is no expectation of sex. And then they would say, like, and then I would skip out of your studio feeling very free and empowered and liberated, and then wake up in the morning and go like, crap, what did I do? You know, but that's like a regular.
But at least it's a reaction, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a reaction. Hannah, you don't, is it fair to say you don't work commercially, but within the field of art? I mean, do you do commercial work as well as artwork?
I do.
I just wondered how this influences you.
I do. I suppose the way I run my career is by not necessarily running it, but just what my work attracts and what comes in. So, you know, it can be commercial, it can be an artist commission, it can be a residency, it can be all sorts of things. And I love the freedom of that because I am a photographer. I love the different applications, the different languages of photography. It's such a complex language, and it is the language in which we communicate today through photography. So, you know, for me, it's one of those things that the more photography and the more experience I can get, and particularly as an artist, and having work in collections and thinking about photography in that way, that to be able to apply it commercially is really interesting to me. And I think, you know, this kind of came about in the late 90s. It was a crossover between art and commercial, and that has really continued. And I think if you look at a lot of young, not necessarily young, but female photographers, that they diversify because they're creating their own unique language that they can apply in a commercial context. So, you know, that's, I suppose, really what where I'm coming from, and how photography has shaped me. And, you know.
How has it shaped you? And then I'll ask that same question to Dragana. Hannah, how has it shaped you?
Well, you know, it is interesting because when I started, and I'm obviously, you know, it depends where you are in the world, and I was in the 80s in Belfast, and you know, and even all the way through probably to the mid 90s, photography wasn't considered an art form. And I thought, my God, this is such a complex medium. How could you not say it's an art form? For many reasons, you can see why. And also there was this idea that going back to a very kind of male-dominant industry, that women didn't really do photography on the ground, if you like. And you know, these two statements kind of give me a sense of purpose and a sense of, you know, resistance by making my own work. And they have probably guided me through the last 20 years of why I do this. You know, photography is an amazing art form, and women should be kind of connected to it in a very deep, intuitive way, rather than kind of just sort of absorbing these subliminal images that we're seeing the whole time. To engage with it.
Dragana, same question.
I mean, I guess like I always use photography in a way to make sense of the world around me. In the beginning, it was like a real comforter, you know, during the war, and then, well, actually during my entire life, anytime when I had to make sense out of something, like I started doing my own, the 100 Muses when I was kind of turning 40, and I needed to deal with some of my own kind of body issues and way I was, you know, having a conversation with myself around what is to be a woman, and actually what I wanted to say, which is important as well, like I used to be a psychologist before I was a photographer, and when I started working on the 100 Muses, what I didn't expect that it would turn into a kind of therapy session with like about 80% of the people. I mean, I didn't know about my background, but I think when you take your clothes off in front of the stranger, you might as well tell them about all your trauma as well. So, well, actually, what was shocking is that so many women spoke about abuse. This was before Me Too, and abuse, rape. I mean, horrendous things, and you can, you know, that it is so prevalent in our society that something like this was inflicted on such a huge part of the population, and I think there is lots of people who suffer in silence because they think it's just them, but there was so much of it.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask both of you, you know, have recent radical female-led movements like #MeToo or Time's Up liberated the female subject to tell a new, largely unheard narrative? But Dragana, you're saying that they were speaking to you before this.
Yeah. But I think these things are tidal waves, you know. They have to start somewhere, and you know, before there is a manifestation like a hashtag, you know, there is a whole swell that happens before that.
Okay, let's go back to the questions that are coming in. There are a few technical questions. Are you guys happy to go with the technical aspect? This is one of the first questions that came in. Nate Paluga saying, great work. Could you talk about the technical aspects of your photography, what camera, etc.? Hannah, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I started photography, it was analog, and it was, I would consider it a lot more difficult. I've worked with, because I studied photography, I've worked with every type of camera. So in analog, it worked from 35mm to an 8x10 camera. And now I shoot digital, actually. And I find that shooting digital has changed the way I photograph, because the difference between shooting an 8x10 film on a film camera, which is very slow, you have the big dark cloth and the, the slide, you know, you're very selective. It's a very different way of looking at the world. And when you're shooting on digital, you're kind of, for me, I'm choosing from the world to complete a whole, but the whole isn't necessarily in the, it's not necessarily complete image. It's kind of changed how I make images, if you like. So yeah, I use a medium format camera. It's very discreet. And the thing that I find really exciting about digital is they all have backs. So when you're taking photographs, you see what, you know, you can see what it is, and more, you can adjust and work from it. So you're not kind of working blind as such, but also you can show the person, the woman, in my case, my subject, the image, and work together and have a much more collaborative sort of experience of photography. And I find this amazing. I'm always blown away by how strongly people feel about the medium and how they can very quickly say what they like about it. They can sort of change their gesture. It's an active engagement with each other. And that, I think what Dragna was saying about your muses is that it breaks down the hierarchy. You're not behind the camera and, you know, sort of photographer, subject and viewer. You're, through being able to show, to involve your subject, for me anyway, this is what I think, you're allowing kind of a picture that is more communicative and more asking questions rather than just being off this actual person. It's more sort of subjective perhaps, and a digital has definitely allowed me to do that. I love film though. Film, there's nothing that's ever surpassed film, unfortunately. The pain in the ass.
Thank you. Dragana, what camera?
Well, I mean, I'm promiscuous when it comes to, like, I shot You the Lost Country on medium format, and for the very reason Hannah mentioned here, the 100 muses were shot digitally, so the women can see them in real time and edit them live. So depends on the project. I don't a lot of times use my phone as well. I'm not as hung up on, I mean, I love film and I will never, I mean, I would shoot film if I had, you know, most of the time.
Thank you. Letitia Priato, pardon if I haven't got that said correctly, but has asked, what has been the biggest challenge so far that you've encountered as women photographers in your career? Is there a specific event or moment you could recall and would like to share? Thanks so much to both of you. Hannah.
I suppose actually kind of to try and to find, for me actually, what I wanted when I began was my autonomy. You know, the idea that, and this is the great thing about working as an artist, because you may be poor, but you're certainly free, and no one sort of dictates to you what to do. So you're not working in a commercial sense. And you know, to be able to have that autonomy and your own agency in the world and your own way of making pictures that quite possibly can be recognized out of the endless sea of images that exist on a daily basis. That's kind of a challenge for me, and interests me.
Dragana.
I think for me the most challenging things that I come across quite often is when I hear sometimes male colleagues or industry insiders talk about other women photographers that I know, and that get usually, labeled as crazy or talking too much and stuff like that, which is very interesting because they don't use the same measuring stick when they talk about kind of the male, superheroes or something.
It's
So
interesting
it's
that we go back to
yeah.
the question, one of the questions here, why should gender matter? It still does. There are a couple of questions that I could almost tie together. Thank you. And I'm just bear with me while I get them up on the screen. Lisa Doyle, thank you. She's asking, do either of you have any advice for a female photographer hoping to get into the photography industry? I'm a 23-year-old master's student in the UK, and I just want to share that as well with Jade Ashley Squires asks, do you have any advice for young artists working in this area? And Emer McGuire says, do either of you have advice for a young photographer who enjoys photography as a hobby and would love to turn this hobby into a career, but unsure where to start? So it's all kind of there are three different questions, but they're all dealing, Hannah, in the same area, aren't they? It's how do you get into it?
I think the education route is very good but when I did it, it was all free, so it's a very big commitment.
Yeah.
I think if it's your form of communication, like a writer, like great literature, it's something that you have to do. So it's what keeps you sane. It's what allows you to communicate in the world. So you just do it. And there are so many platforms now for people with different, there's obviously online platforms. Instagram seems to be a really good way for people to be discovered. I think kind of, it's an industry, and I'm not sure why, but it's an industry that in education, it's, most photography courses are predominantly women. But in the outside world, that percentage falls off to very low, to about 30%. And I'm interested in what is actually happening to young women in photography. And I have a few theories that are, we've only got sort of 10 minutes left, so I can't go into them at the minute. But I would say that as a female photographer, there's so many advantages. And even if you're not interested in gender or defining yourself in that way, the amount of platforms that have opened up that you can talk about who you are as an individual or what your identity is, kind of from your own perspective. And I think that's really important at the minute when we're questioning identity and how we represent each other, and kind of a sort of freedom of you have to be seen in the world. It's very hard to be it's that old adage, you cannot be what you cannot see. And this goes across the board, however you kind of relate to being female, it's from your perspective. That's what's really important at the minute. And my daughters, their teenage friends, I'm amazed how many young women want to be photographers. And I always say to them, start with your life, because your life is really interesting. We want to know what it's like from a 16-year-old's perspective about how their life is, because it's such a succinct way of communicating. And like I said, image is power. And it starts from something that is fundamentally you. Unless you want to be a commercial photographer or a fashion photographer, there's all sorts of things you can be. But I think that's what I find.
Thank you, Dragana.
I think for the perseverance is everything, because not only in photography, in art world, because you can see, I see that people just drop off because they give themselves a year or 2 years and nothing happens, and they get so disillusioned and they go away. Like I tell all my students, put between 5-7 years and make sure to put in your head that nothing is going to happen unless you're incredibly lucky. And then after those 5 to 7 years, if you don't see stuff moving, even after all the hard work and promoting your work, then maybe reconsider your career choice. But I think, as Hannah said, also for me, I never felt like it was a choice. You know, I didn't feel. I mean, I tried to do something else first, and I was incredibly unhappy, so I had to go back.
There are
Whatever.
lots of questions coming in. Mark, but it's not so much a question as a Mark Pickthall is saying, I admire my female professional colleagues. We do look at the native in different ways, and this difference, or the narrative in different ways, and this difference should be celebrated. There are a couple of things, Dragana, coming in, particularly about your 100 muses, and then somebody, you did say that you, and I've written that down as well, Hannah, about going back to the Mary Magdalene in ecstasy that you wanted to talk about, which is an incredible one. A couple of things, Dragana, if I could go to you. An anonymous attendee says some of the sitters of 100 muses present themselves in classicized sculptural poses. Do you think this undermines their autonomy if they are simply imitating the way male artists have traditionally positioned their female sitters? And then I'll bring Emma Piggott's question in to this as well. What advice would you give for women photographers who want to work with a female body but don't want to possibly reproduce an internalized male gaze? So it's actually, it seems to be that the anonymous attendant thing that it actually came from the sitters themselves rather than you.
Well, basically, they chose their own pose, and I understand the question. And I joked with some of my sitters about it. And like one woman was moving and she was like, oh my God, this is like Olympia. This is, you know, like we have been trained to, by looking at all this male artist depiction, we have started arranging ourselves in such a way. You know, like it's not unusual. It's just a result of our education and the visual images that we have been presented until now. So it's normal. It's nothing. I don't think they have diminished themselves. Like most of the women totally recognize what was happening, but couldn't break through.
Isn't that interesting though, that they were putting themselves into the positions, then realizing what they were doing, and then looking around thinking, well, where do I sit now? You know, nobody's telling me. The really interesting thing comes from Riley Arthur. Thank you for this. How much, Hannah, I'll put this to you. How much does writing inform or contextualize your work? And do you find writing about your work challenging?
Yeah, because I am dyslexic, and you know, from a child was dyslexic and could have navigated the world through images. So writing is the last thing that I want to do, and I think it's probably why I'm a photographer in that. And I also work in single images, and also my art, when it's on the wall, is kind of a certain scale. It's 1 meter by 1.5 meters. So for me, it's all about the image. I feel if I have to write text, and this is kind of old school, that I have contextualized the image so tightly that the viewer can't project themselves necessarily into the narrative of the image and what it might mean and what it might mean to them, and what it kind of shows in our relationship with photography and our internal conversations and conscious bias, all that sort of stuff. So I try and keep text to minimal, but I do read a lot about photography, and I'm asked to write a lot about photography over the years, you know, whether they're interviews. The last 2 projects I did for lockdown, they were you know, published in media outlets, and I had to write a text for that, and I loved it. You know, you can, especially probably for somebody who's starting writing, you know, their ego is like, oh, that sounds quite good. But it's kind of more of an introduction rather than a contextualizing of the image for me.
Interesting when you talk about bias. Dragana, Emily James asks, do you think that in the future there will be no female or male gaze, and whether race and class will play bigger roles than they already do when it comes to subject choice and representation bias?
I mean, I really hope so. I like to live long enough to experience all those. I mean, but class issues for me sometimes much more damaging, especially when it comes to the art education and who ends up in the art education, and how we like basically cull the entire level of society of working class students who can't even consider this as a career choice, and that what kind of projects we have as a result. and what is dominating the art market today. That is something that it's maybe a topic for some other talk, but
It's a huge one. People are really enjoying this talk. They're huge fans of your work. Jonathan Moore says, I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for this talk. Although I'm not a woman myself, I really admire all the work that female artists and just females as a whole are doing with these discussions, because it's all still so relevant, especially for this generation of aspiring artists as well, to educate the more narrow-minded view of the world. So thanks again, big fan of both your works. So thank you very much for that. Somebody who I think who knows you, Hannah Julia Fullerton Batten, saying, Hannah Julia here, enjoying this very much, thank you. Just curious why she uses this in capital letters, don't use Instagram yourself, and she sends you hugs as well. Let's then go to the Magdalene. Let's go back, because I'm very aware that we've got about 5 minutes left. People loving the talk. So Claire Gormley says, amazing talks. I was wondering if Hannah could speak a little about the image of Mary Magdalene in ecstasy that she ended on, and possibly about the relationship of the female gaze to notions of pleasure, desire, agency in her work. Hannah.
In 4 minutes, okay.
You still have to let Dragana back and be able to talk.
No,
So,
I think
in
Hannah
a
can take
succinct
this
way, please. Yeah.
Well, this is Artissima. She was a 17th Renaissance female painter, one of the few, probably one of the only ones that we know now, and probably one of the best. I mean, she was right up there with Caravaggio. She has an exhibition, well, there's an exhibition of her work in the National Gallery, and in between lockdown, I nipped in to see it with a friend. And, you know, this is a woman that was working, you know, in the Renaissance times, and I looked at her work and I had a direct connection and a kind of resonance with what she was saying through her female figures, and it's been quite a revelation for me. So it's really worth looking at her story and thinking about kind of great sort of how women kind of rock the boat and change the discourse around how women are represented, and particularly what Dragna is saying. You know, she never painted any of her female subjects nude in the way that maybe her Renaissance male counterparts were doing. And her female characters I think they're a hybrid of her. She did do self-portraits, but she put character into the women and give them their own agency and autonomy in this work. And it's just so exciting for me to be able to have that conversation over so many centuries and a different medium. I mean, obviously that was the photography of the day, painting, but it's every time you kind of delve into any of her work, and particularly Mary Magdalene, it's so from a female perspective that it shocks me how vibrant and relevant it still is. So look her up, you know.
Yeah, we will definitely. Amy Dargogne asked a question, and it's been sitting here, Dragon. It's a big question, but I want to at least say it, that your work seems to span from a quite formal documentary style to a much more abstract and instinctive reaction to the subject you're addressing. How do you decide the best way or style of photography to use to approach a subject? She says, do you go through a long testing period before deciding on the best method in which to present and investigate your chosen subject? And she says, I hope that makes sense. So hopefully it does.
I think it's, I think there is a definite, but there's lots of research beforehand, and then the kind of intuitive testing happens that usually decides, then I stick to a formula, and I have to, because I think, I mean, I have like ADD, so if I don't put a very constrained, you know, like constraints really around my project, like my brain would just explode. So I have to be very precise about how I approach a project. But depends what, I mean, I think I work in documentary, but it is crossing, you know, like with my own unknown, especially the story of my aunt. It's a fictionalized biography what I'm doing.
Thank you. Three more questions left and then we'll wrap. But these are, well, there's two that are similar. Christine Donaghy asks, who is your female artist or photographer? And then anonymous attendee says, what photographers have been influences for your work? Really interesting conversation. Thank you. So Hannah, in 60 seconds, who's a fave for you?
All the women in the history of photography, they all have their unique stories and they're all role models for me. You know, when Eve Arnold first started at Magnum, and possibly this is why I call myself a female photographer, in that she never wanted to be kind of described as a female photographer, because to say you were female in those days would have been a kind of negative thing. It would have kind of distracted from your talent. So to have to deny your own gender is something, and also this is particular to your generation. It's something that I wanted to not have to deny, you know. So they're all of their time, and they're all about the kind of probably the feminist journey and the journey of photography and the history of the medium itself. You know, they run parallel to each other. And the women, the protagonists, female protagonists in both these stories are always very interesting role models to me.
Dragana, your favorite?
Well, I don't have a favorite. I'm gonna be political like Hannah and to say it's everyone, but I do remember one specific project and a photographer that really changed it for me, and that was Jo Spence and her work that she did, like with breast cancer when she discovered, and I just remember seeing that and the rawness, and I just thought, wow, you know, and that really kind of, that did something to me.
It was real. It was authentic.
Exactly.
All your questions are coming in now. Terry Core, he's put a big spanner in the works just before we go and wrap. But I'm gonna say it anyway. Have either artist any views on the sculpture to celebrate Mary Wollstonecraft? The female is depicted naked. Hannah.
You know, I caught a snippet about that. She's coming out of a stone, a black mass, which I think is interesting. But to be honest, I haven't seen it, and I can't really comment on it, apart from it's about time there was a bloody, you know, commemoration statue for Mary. She was the beginning of all of this.
Yeah. Dragana, have you seen it?
I've seen it, and also, like, I think it's very difficult to comment when you don't see something live. So I'm sure that the artist had a good reason to depict her the way she did.
Okay, thank you, Catherine Jacket. Oh gosh, forgive me, Catherine. Thank you very much for this very inspiring and authentic talk. Terry says great answers. You've satisfied him. Thank you. Elena Getman. Look, this is a biggie, but Elena's been sitting there. What are the ways to develop creativity and the way ideas appear? Hannah, struck by the news.
It's like magic. It's like flipping a switch, really. I don't know what it is. I think, you know, it's something that in terms of neurology or neuroscience, I'm sure we'll find the mechanisms of the chemicals involved. But at the minute, I think it's just called like the eureka moment, or the I don't know. But it's something that. And it must be dopamine, because when you start doing it and you start getting into it and you start focusing it and realizing you're working and you're communicating with people, that it's just the best feeling, really.
Dragana?
Well, yeah, the flow, the feeling of flow is the most amazing one you can experience. But I would just say, if you're read as much as you can, listen to music, watch movies, like just, you know, there's so much incredible art being created up till now. Like, explore as much as you can, and I'm sure it's going to, you know, light some fires and open some windows in your mind.
Apologies for that. I had my phone on mute and I still got a message. Paula says, fabulous talk. Thanks so much. I can't take any credit for that. I have two great speakers. Diane White is saying, thank you all. Really interesting talk, very generous. I agree on that. The generosity of this has been second to none. Dragana, Lauren Abraham asks, are you planning a reprint of the book You, the Lost Country?
Oh my God. So I started writing this book about my aunt in 2014, and I said I'm not going to do a second edition of You until this one is published, but it's taking me a long time. So I might revisit this now in 2021. Maybe both the You comes again and this one also comes at the same time.
Well, look, thank you, Mary Maxwell. That's your final one. Thanks so much for such a great talk. It has been absolutely joyous hearing you both talk, to see your work, to see you talking so eloquently and generously about it. We must end there. My thanks to my guests, Hannah Starkey and Dragana Jurisic, and to Belfast Photo Festival as well for facilitating this. From me, Mary Louise Muir, Belfast Photo Festival's Michael Weir, goodbye and thank you for watching.